Imagine a desperate moment when literally everything is falling apart around you, and how grace can sometimes appear in the absolute most unexpected ways. Today, we're going to dive into this explainer by exploring a fascinating parallel between a massive mid-20th century crisis in Korea and an ancient biblical narrative from about 2,700 years ago. We'll see exactly what both of these moments can teach us about humility and restoration.
Let's set the scene. I want you to picture a packed, completely desperate Busan in 1951. It's right in the thick of the Korean War, immediately following the January 4th retreat. Countless refugees have flooded into the city, essentially becoming homeless overnight. Imagine you've lost your home, your livelihood, and maybe even your loved ones. You are displaced in a strange, crowded city. When Sunday rolls around, what kind of prayer do you even pray during a war?
Well, the answer they came up with was a desperate plea for national salvation. You see, these displaced people didn't just pray for their own individual comfort or safety. They actually united with one single heart to repent and beg for the survival of their entirely fractured country. It was this massive collective movement of the soul right in the middle of complete physical devastation.
Right at the epicenter of this movement was Charyong Church. It was founded way back in 1892 by missionary William Baird, and it was widely known as the Mother Church south of the Han River. So it had this really deep spiritual heritage. But by 1951, as this massive influx of refugees hit the city, this historic church suddenly found itself at the absolute center of a monumental humanitarian crisis. So how did the church react? Honestly, it's incredibly inspiring. Reverend Han Sang-dong and his congregation responded with radical hospitality. They didn't lock their doors to protect their property. Instead, they gave up their main sanctuary. They gave up their courtyard. They set up these massive tents in empty lots, and because they didn't have cushions or chairs, they laid simple straw mats directly on the muddy ground to create temporary shelters and places to worship. They sacrificed their own comfort entirely to provide shelter for the displaced. Section 1. Hezekiah's Unexpected Letter, a pivot to ancient Israel. Now, what's really wild is how this modern story perfectly mirrors an event recorded in ancient Israel, some 2,700 years ago. The story starts with King Hezekiah taking the throne of the southern kingdom of Judah. He inherited a nation in complete spiritual decay from his father Ahaz, who had literally nailed the doors of the Jerusalem temple shut. As soon as Hezekiah became king, he took 3 crucial steps to undo all that neglect. He cleansed the temple, re-established the priests, and restored the collapsed system of worship. Basically, he put his own house in order first.
But once he secured his own kingdom, Hezekiah did something unexpected. He looked beyond his borders. The geopolitical reality of the time was pretty stark. Southern Judah was thriving and restoring worship, while northern Israel, which had been violently divided from the south for centuries, had recently been utterly destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The capital was captured and the people were scattered and stateless. Yet, Hezekiah decided to reach out.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Forgotten Passover, restoring an ancient identity. Hezekiah actually sent couriers straight into this ruined enemy territory to invite these scattered people to Jerusalem for the Passover. This was a monumental move, mainly because the Israelites had largely forgotten its true meaning. It hadn't been observed properly as a unified assembly since the days of Joshua and Solomon, which was hundreds of years prior. Hezekiah was trying to resurrect an ancient shared identity for a people who had completely lost their way. And this brilliantly maps out what we could call the geography of grace. Hezekiah's decree was sent from Beersheba to Dan. Now, this is a famous idiom in the text. Beersheba is the absolute southernmost tip of Judah, and Dan is the furthest northern tip of Israel. By using this phrase, it proved that Hezekiah's invitation transcended all political borders and centuries of historical grudges. It wasn't just for his people, it was an all-encompassing invitation meant for the entirety of God's people, no matter how ruined they were. Section 3. The core message. An invitation, not condemnation. Think about it. If you're a citizen of the ruined North, you're probably expecting a gloating "I told you so" message from the wealthy South. But Hezekiah's letter was a spiritual lifeline, and it hinged on a single Hebrew word, shuv. It simply means to return. The promise woven into this letter was revolutionary. If the people return to God, God will return to them. It wasn't about punishing them for the mistakes that destroyed their nation, it was just about offering a path back home. The absolute crux of it is captured right here in verse 9. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful and will not turn away his face from you if you return to him. This was absolutely not a notice of judgment, telling a ruined people that they were finished. It was a pure, boundary-breaking invitation of grace.
It told people who had entirely given up on themselves that, hey, it wasn't too late.
That leads us right into Section 4, Mockery versus Humility, two reactions to grace. Because let's be real, when you offer grace to a ruined, divided people, you definitely don't always get a unified response. As Hezekiah's couriers went from city to city, many people literally laughed them to scorn and mocked them. Why? Because they were driven by hurt, pride, and centuries of bitter division. Imagine the psychological barrier of accepting help from a former enemy when you're at rock bottom. But on the flip side, there were those who humbled themselves. They laid down that immense national pride and they accepted the invitation.
There's another beautiful Hebrew word that describes the people who did accept. Kana. It means to lower oneself or to humble. Some men of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun experienced this. They bravely lowered themselves, swallowed their pride, endured the likely mockery of their own neighbors, and traveled as stateless refugees into former enemy territory just to accept this grace.
And here is where it all ties back to 1951 Busan. This ancient reaction perfectly mirrors the two types of refugees who fled to Choyang Church. There were likely those who turned away in pride, thinking, I used to be wealthy, I had a highly respectable church up north, I absolutely refused to sit on a muddy straw mat in someone else's courtyard. But then, there were those who knelt on the straw mats. They had lost everything, but they humbled themselves to hold on to God. Because ultimately, grace can only flow downwards. It flows to those willing to lower themselves, whether that's in ancient Jerusalem or on a muddy church lawn in Korea.
Which brings us to our final section, an invitation to grace and the ultimate fulfillment.
You see, Hezekiah's letter wasn't just some isolated piece of historical trivia. For believers, the cross itself is the ultimate fulfillment of that letter. It's God's personal letter of grace sent to ruined, scattered people who think they have absolutely no hope left. It's an invitation sent to spiritual refugees, people wandering around because of failures, wounds, or shattered pride, saying, you can return, and you can be with us too.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. The invitation is always there, but the response? Well, that is entirely up to us. When the invitation of grace arrives in your life, will you stand stiffly and mock it out of pride, protecting your ego? Or will you humble your heart, kneel on the proverbial straw mat, and return? The choice, just as it was thousands of years ago, is entirely yours.